Today we learned about solving inequalities. So I'm going to take some problems that we could factor out, and I'm going to teach you how to solve inequalities. So the first problem that we're looking at is going to be 2p squared minus 14p minus 36 is less than or equal to 0. So I have a problem like this, and we talked today about the steps that we had. And the first step that we have is we need to solve the inequality like as if it was an equation. And so what that means is that I can use the x factor, or I can use if a is not equal to 1 after I factor out the greatest common factor, then I can use the x factor in the box. But looking at this quadratic equation we have right here, I can see that in my terms on this side of the equation, each of the terms has a 2 as a factor. So I'm going to factor out right away 2. So I still set that less than or equal to 0. So then at this point, I'm going to use the x factor to factor this part, to factor my quadratic. So that's going to be negative 18, and that's going to be negative 7. And I use the x factor because at this point, a is equal to 1, because I factor it out of 2. So I have the factors negative 9 and positive 2. So I have p plus 2 times p minus 9 is equal to 0, because I'm solving it as if it was an equation. So to solve for the factors, I set each of the factors equal to 0, or to solve for p, I set each of the factors equal to 0. And then I have p minus 9 is equal to 0. And so at this point, I subtract 2 from both sides. So p is equal to negative 2. And then I add 9 to both sides, and p is equal to 9. Excuse me. So I've solved it. So now once I've solved this, I graph my roots on the number line. And we talked about whenever I solve it, that these are called my solution, my zeros, or my roots. I can use either of those words to describe that. So I take my roots and I factor it on a number line in order that it would be a true number line. And my next step is I look at my inequality sign to see if it's an open circle or a closed circle. And my inequality sign indicates that it's going to be a closed circle on my roots. So now when I get to this point, I am going to choose a value for p that is not my roots, one of my roots. So I'm kind of taking negative 2 and 9 out of the equation. And we talked today about trying to choose 0, because 0 is pretty easy to plug in. So I can go back to my original equation, or I can go back to this one, it doesn't matter which one, and I can plug in 0 for p. And in this case, it's going to be 2 times 0 squared minus 14 times 0 minus 36 is less than or equal to 0. And these two terms cancel out, so then I'm left with negative 36 is less than or equal to 0. And we ask ourselves, is that true? And it is true. So I plugged this back into the original equation. Or inequality, inequality. And so then I see if it's true. See if inequality is true. And at this point, I say, if yes, point to that on the number line, or point to the number line. Point to that value on the number line. And I'll describe that. So for instance, since it was yes, then I go from 2 and I point to the 0. And since it's yes, I go from the 9 and I point to the 0. So, but if it was no, I pointed away from that value, point away from that value. So that kind of gives you an indication of how to do it. Now, that's what the number line is going to look like, and a lot of times you're going to have to write the inequality. So this is where I use the situation of I put x here in the middle, I put 9 on one side and negative 2 on the other, because that's really what I'm comparing it to. So for instance, I have negative 2, and then I have x, and then I have 9. So I have to see, is negative 2 greater than or equal to or less than or equal to 2? And you can see it's less than or equal to 2, and then x is less than or equal to 9. So this would be my answer. This would be my graph, and this would be my answer that goes on along with it. So in this case, it's an and situation, because negative 2 is less than or equal to x, and it's less than or equal to 9. And then we have a situation that could possibly be an or situation. So hopefully I will choose an example that will give me an example of this. So I have r squared minus 14r plus 40. So I'm going to make this greater than 0. So I'm going to do my x factor, and a is equal to 1, so I can just do the x factor, and I don't have any common factors. My a times c is 40, my b is negative 14, and then I have negative 10, and I have negative 4 as my factors. So I'm going to have r minus 10 times r minus 4 is equal to 0, set it equal to 0, solve for r minus 10 is equal to 0, and r minus 4 is equal to 0, add 10, so r is equal to 10, add 4, so r is equal to 4. At this point, my second step was I graphed my roots. So I have a 4 and I have a 10 as my roots. And I can look up top, look at my inequality sign, and see that I have open zeros on the, or open circles on those two values. Now I'm going to choose a number that's on the number line that's not 4 or 10, and again, 0 is not one of my numbers, so I'm going to choose that, and I plug it into here. So I have 0 squared minus 14 times 0 plus 40 is greater than 0. And in this case, it is true. So I'm going to point towards the 0. And in this case, the 0 is here. So I have an or situation. So I'm going to point towards the 0, so I know it's either going to be inside the two numbers or it's going to point outside the two numbers. And if you want to figure this out and to do a problem, you can choose like 11 or choose the number 12 or choose the number 20 and plug it in, and you would see that any number that's greater than 10 would also make it true. So in this situation, I know that I have x values that are going to be over here, and I have x values that are going to be over there. So I have x values that are going to be less than 4, and then I have x values that are going to be greater than 10. So I can either write it this way, or I can say x is greater than 4, or because it looks like the oars on a boat, x is greater than 10. So you have those two types of scenarios right there. So hopefully that'll help you with solving inequalities.